on a concept.
Alright, good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Ranch in Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting digital allegory. Alright, before I get into modeling the dinosaur bones, I'm going to give him an aura first to clean up all of the edges and make his form more pronounced. So I've got a bright red mixed up, and let's get to it. Alright, let's get this lowered a little bit.
Kind of religious upbringing, I guess, total vacuum.
There we go. So bright red aura on T-Rex.
To start when you're an adult.
Coming up.
And then you can acquire whatever religious training you want. Sort of considering all with an open mind. Now, I never considered all with an open mind and decided whether to have one or none. I just didn't bother to think about it, and then I studied, psychoanalysis and music and physics and eventually mathematics that has no relationship to any religious tradition. So eventually the 60s happened, and probably my first experience that I would now identify as a real religious experience was the experience of LSD and whatever intrinsic meaning it carried to me without too much suggestion from the setting, the popular books, and so on. And I immediately thought, as many people did in those days, but not so many today, I think, that this was a religious experience in the true sense of religion, as was probably lost from organized religion, which I knew on the basis of no knowledge or anything, just a guess. Because, of course, I knew people. In fact, practically everybody I did know went to some kind of church, or at least had been brought up with one and formally rejected it. And through them, I got the idea that there was no evidence of any sacred knowledge outstanding in any of these churches. Through, eventually, in the study of art, architecture, music, and so on, I could see in the recent past that there had been a sacred knowledge in the churches of Europe that was embodied in the architecture, the music, and so on. It occurred to me that there might be what I had recently discovered in the form of religion had become extinct only in the recent past in the Western world. And these were just idle thoughts, as in these days, in the 60s, we were very preoccupied with politics. Then, when I got to India, I found that this lapse of the extinction of the sacred in organized religion was sort of reduced to zero there, that at least with the jungle babas and so on, you had a live tradition of identification with sacred, what I recognized as sacred at that time, and an easy sharing of the idea of it with the student chelas and so on. And then, when I returned from India to California, about the time I met you, Terence, I began to think that there might be some way to revitalize the Western tradition. Of course, other people were speaking about this also, particularly those concerned with Western yoga, the remnants of the adepts of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and so on. And of course, we had our great influence from the Theosophists and the studies of alchemy and so on. But there was still, at this time in 1972, a tremendous separation between political activity, which we were still involved with, particularly around issues of chemical pollution and things like that, on one hand, and the loss of the sacred in religion on the other hand. I mean, it was more like, it's a shame this pretty thing is gone. And then in the course of time, these came together, and in the suggestion, which now I see many people have made in their books about it, that what's gone wrong in the world now is actually, a root cause is the loss of the connection to the sacred within and without organized religion. After this connection is made, then political activity has to address this. I mean, if people have different theories of evil, I would call them, loss of the partnership society in 1400 BC, or the loss of the sacred in church ritual after the scientific revolution, or the population explosion and the advance of modern medicine in reducing infant mortality, and so on. The different theories of evil, because of the strength of the direct experience I had with the sacred, this became and remains my favorite theory of evil. So if I was going to direct myself to some activity, not exactly save the world, but at least to hope in that direction, then I would try to create for some larger portion of humanity the lost thread of connection to the sacred. So this is the program that we have all thought about under the name the resacralization of the world. So as far as I know, there are just a few proposals for any kind of direct action that go in this direction. One is the resumption of rituals not native to us, but native to other people that still exist in some kind of live form, such as the shamanism of native tribes. And another idea is the revitalization of existing religion by finding means to re-attract people to the wonderful churches of the Western world, having not only the shape, the architectural shape, most appropriate for communication with this sacred thread, but also the tradition, the morphic field, the runnel, the creode of this connection, by figuring out through some sort of archaeology of knowledge the missing link. When was it that this went out? For what reason? Was it that the organ replaced singing in the church, or what was it? Whatever it was, to do experiments on bringing it back. And another idea is to remain within the context of Western society, but outside the organized churches. Replace churches with an equivalent institution, perhaps based in the sacred arts, music, architecture, painting, and so on. And another one that we have all given great attention to, and I'm beginning to think too much attention, is the revitalization of science, acknowledging that science has replaced the traditional Christian mythology with its own substitute mythology, and the weaknesses of this mythology are at the root of evil. So those are four things I put on my list as top candidates already discussed. And in this connection, we probably should keep in mind the partnership society, because there's a connection. I mean, it's suggested, I think, in these works like Leon Eisler's on the partnership society, that the disintegration, the devitalization, the decline of the church, of organized religion, of the significance of organized religion, is associated with the patriarchal transformation of society and the embodiment of the patriarchal values within the organized church, in the papal hierarchy of the Roman Church and so on, had contributed to the roots of its decline. So my favorite idea at the moment from this list has to do with rituals, these New Year's rituals and so on. I would take the Eleusinian mysteries as a model. And I don't think that everybody should take psychedelics, for example, or have a shamanistic experience in the Amazon jungle in order to reawaken, to rebuild their connection to the divine. But it could be that the churches and their rituals and so on could be reinvigorated by having a certain class of priesthood, as Jesuits and so on, that maybe a new class that specialized in maintaining this connection with the purity of this connection, being devoid of any intrinsic cultural overlay. And that could be one component among many. the weaknesses of the scientific mythology could be somehow fixed by incorporating scientific worldview into the church view and so on. So some sort of syncretism between the Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian model, including its patriarchal weakness for the moment, trying to repair that in the ways that people are doing in the new church movement. And in the inclusion of the sacrament, at least for a holy elite, the resacralization of music, I think, is very important. If I had to point to a single factor that I thought was destroying society faster than another, it would be evil music and personal bias. Well, that's my view for a start on the resacralization of society. In short, I'm looking for something beyond the understanding of the virtues of the past that could be the basis of some kind of program in the present, even if it wasn't something that we could do, but something that we could foresee that might happen that would create a successful society here.
Very interesting, Neil.
Very interesting.
Why don't you just say a tiny bit more about what constitutes evil music?
Well, since Orpheus, Pythagoras, and so on, there has been a permanent tradition of sacred music. And we have sacred music is still played in various places. We have recordings of Gregorian chants and Gurdjieff playing and so on. But the best analysis of the relationship between style in music and style in society that I've come across is Cyril Scott. Cyril Scott is somebody that Janice Rosé pointed out to me. This was a moderately famous composer and pianist in England. And his pieces aren't well known, but he's in the process of rediscovery now. And some people have said, who are serious musical scholars, that he will one day rank with Beethoven. That might be an overvaluation. Anyway, he's an interesting composer. I've heard his music played. And he wrote a book called, I forget, The Harmony of the Spheres or something, in which he analyzed the particular contribution and the evolution of Western society of the various composers, for example, Debussy and Buxtehude and Bach and so on. I don't remember the details. He said, for example, that I think the women's movement, when it began in England, was enabled by a Handel. There's something about Handel which is supportive for political revolution and not for other things. And Beethoven developed the romantic and the emotional in German culture. This is spelled out in a book. Now, if Cyril Scott were alive today and watched MTV, I'm sure that he would say that this worldview embodied in this music was leading rather than following the decline of the biosphere. And he would see a causal connection. And I think we can take that as a hypothesis that maybe can't be proved. I have no faith in experiments that have been done with music played to planets and so on, although it might be worth a serious review of that literature at some point.
I see what you're saying.
I think that this music is very harmful to the ears. It's much too loud if you go to a concert. It's harmful. It's physically harmful. It's mentally, it's emotionally harmful. And people flock to this. And I think it takes a long time of listening before you get really tired of it. And that has something to do with the starvation of the soul for beauty. The disconnection. This is the aesthetical side of the disconnection of the human species from some sort of divine guidance, which might go under the name of harmony or the world soul or whatever. If you're not in resonance with this world soul, then you can't have a future.
So the aesthetics of the world soul. Well, a lot of what you're saying is you're talking about an archaic revival, these various things that you listed, the resumption of ritual, the revitalization of existing religion. I agree completely with all of this. The only thing that I would add, and I know you agree, is feminism comes in here somewhere in the form of the revitalization of partnership. I'm not entirely clear. Sometimes you seem to be talking about a revitalization of the forms of the 15th and 16th century, and sometimes much further back, like all this business about organs and churches. That's relatively recent.
Well, there's been loss has been going on for 10,000 years.
For a long, long time.
And in different ages past is something that they couldn't be revived in its original form. They have to use video and film technology.
So you're saying incremental recovery of the Gaelic perspective.
Well, the value of getting the true partnership into the church would mean that we then didn't have to replace the church just because it had been on the wrong track for 5,000 years.
True.
It has to be
true.
Maybe it's possible without rebuilding the Gothic cathedrals.
But isn't this a little like trying to reform the Soviet Union and keeping the Communist Party around? I think the momentum of these institutions makes them hard to reform.
Well, the organization that collects the money and buys the land and so on might be totally replaced. But I think the architecture is good, and I think that the current music is evil.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Even though an analyst more expert than myself could maybe see dominative forms are built into the actual architecture of many of the cathedrals, I still think it's possible to revive them, that their form would take new meaning because of the life going on inside. If we have to start from scratch, figuring out architecture for a partnership society, then that's going to be very difficult. And I don't know if we'll have time to succeed.
Well, I think beginning with a revival of Gothic cathedral building in the high metriological style of Chartres sounds just fine. I certainly think that the Romanesque style is a dominator style and a ponderous and uncomfortable way to do it. But I love the Gothic and Gothic revival. I mean, this is a celebration of vegetation and lightness and air. And
well, my sentiments exactly. I mean, I'm very interested to hear this proposal of Russ, because it's something that I've formulated and it's starting from a different point of view, and try to follow it. Because as a practicing member of the Church of England, I obviously think that there's a value in the traditional continuity of the institution. I also believe that the way forward is, since it's obvious that organised religion is at one of its lowest ebbs ever, this in a sense creates an extraordinary openness and possibility for change. And I think that one of the ways in which modern Christianity could reconnect with the same sort of sources of inspiration that gave rise to the Gothic cathedrals is partly through the Gothic cathedrals themselves, which, at least in England and throughout the whole of Europe, are all still there. I mean, practically all of them are still functioning, and they still have sacred chants going on in them every day, prayers offered up on a regular cycle, just as great temples should have. They're continuously active sacral places that have been sacral for centuries and lead us to a position that would at least connect us with the kind of ancestral psyche, because they're still functioning. They put us into that particular model of the cosmos that they have. The cathedrals, like temples, are models of the cosmos, and they have all the things that interest us in them in a way. I mean, there's the vegetation principle. There are gargoyles and protector spirits. There are green men, these mysterious vegetation gods that burst out everywhere in this mysterious way. They're usually dedicated, the greatest ones are dedicated to Our Lady, who was seen in various forms, particularly the form of Our Lady of Wisdom and Sophia in the Middle Ages. And they have in their windows geometrical designs. They have threefold mandalas, fourfold mandalas, fivefold mandalas, and there are rose windows with these extremely complex psychedelic mandala things with all these stained glass windows. they have all these qualities. So they're one way, I think, of reconnecting us with the sacred places of Europe, and they connect us to the places and also to the traditional cycle of festivals. So I think that's one important route. I think another important route is through the practice of festivals in general, the sacralization of time, which some Jewish people are doing through revitalizing the tradition of the Sabbath, and the Friday evening lighting the candles with the invocation of the Sabbath bride or the Shekinah, the feminine principles involved in the home and in space and time and in the world and in embodied existence. And anyway, the sacralization of time is another way that can reconnect us with these traditions. And I think the most important aspect of this process, really, because I agree with Terence about the archaic revival, is to find behind the existing forms and existing festivals the pre-Christian roots, which in all cases are the ones that feed the particular timing of the festivals and the particular locations of the sacred places, and which ground the new religion in the old, and connect it through the present tradition as it still goes on. There's a continuous living strand in the tradition that goes right back to the pre-Christian shamanic societies of Europe. So I think that this is a connection that can still work. It works for me. I find it actually works, this connection. I find it does make me feel that I do have an affinity with the cathedrals and the High Middle Ages, and also with the particular places. But then obviously the whole thing has to be tied in with, if this continued sacralization of space and time involves recognizing the importance of sacred places everywhere, of every kind, including the hills and the high places and the sacred groves and the national parks and so on. So it would involve a much more animistic version of Christianity or Judaism, and it would involve the process that I've come to think of as the greening of God, this new greening of God process that's going on. It's theologians who've revived the whole tradition of Hildegard von Bingen and the greening process, and this whole hidden strand of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which may never have been a majority strand, but even as a minority strand can be used to authenticate, feed, and give life to a burgeoning of that aspect of the thing. No, when that's what's needed.
Yes, well, it seems, Ralph, you're sort of advocating this. I find it...
I'm asking, is it possible? I'm not sure.
Well, what I was going to say was, McLuhan said it was inevitable in the sense that he had this notion that he called electronic feudalism, and he felt that the consequence of the shift from illiterate phonetic alphabet cultures, which existed for us as recently as the 1940s, that the replacing of it with electronic forms of media would have an effect on the ratio of the senses, and that the new ratio created by electronic media would be most similar to the ratio of the senses that existed in medieval Europe before the invention of printing. He based this on the idea that before the linear uniformity of print, you had to actually look at manuscript, because every manuscript was different, because it reflected the hand of its author. And that after print was invented, people no longer looked, they read. And this was a very different function where you don't actually study each E and L, you generalize. With television and electronic media, you're again returned to the situation where you must look, you must assemble out of a gestalt, an image. You cannot read it. And he felt that the consequences of this shift in the sense ratio would be global and immense, that it would cause the fragmentation and dissolution of the nation state, which we certainly seem to be seeing in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and that it would return people to a kind of pietistic fundamentalism, homebound because electronic media brings information to you, and that all of these factors would conspire to create an era in which the Gothic model would be very strongly expressed. From my own point of view,
Ooh, 3 minutes. Okay, that's going to take probably 5. So I'm going to cut this and splice together the next section onto it. Here we go. Take
The Middle Ages are certainly an
2. I don't think this will take a full clip,
the
but
glory of the Gothic cathedrals is one side of it,
whatever's left over,
was a
I might pan
time
out
of
or zoom out
wandering,
and
flatulence,
do a little adjusting with some of the rest of the paintings as
bigotry,
well.
suppression of women, hatred of outsiders, insularity, provincialism, barbarism, so forth and so on. But I think we're in an excellent position from McLuhan's point of view and from my own reasoning from entirely different premises to experience something very much like what you're advocating. And I, for one, look forward to it.
Well, I think the conditions under which this transformation could somehow take place would require, first of all, the decentralization. That one of the most patriarchal aspects of the church is the monolithic, centralized government of it. And just as there's the local movements, the little national movements for the resumption of languages such as Welsh and so on, and the return of the Slavic and Baltic states to local control and so on, I think also that churches would have to be returned to local languages in order that their festivals could relate to the local hills, wells and trees and so on. And then on this local basis, the partnership of men and women emerging as a parallel movement within the society would, in the context of this emerging partnership, the locally controlled churches would then be transfigured so that their festivals had a new meaning and took place on the locally appropriate days and so on. And that's just one level that people would have to value their local church. They would have dances in it and actually have their marriages in it and so on. And a lot of rituals would have to be rewritten, and then there would have to be scholarship as to the proper relationship of the ritual and the place. And then there would have to be journals where the scholarship was published or something. Then there would have to be an educational system, something like Sunday school, where this new stuff or old stuff was taught. And it could be that the society is much too rigid for any of these necessary conditions to be created.
What you just described sounded much more like the model of the Anglican Church than the Roman Catholic. I mean, the Anglican Church is autonomous. Each country has its own. The Church of England is the English Church. There's the Church in Wales. There's the Church of Ireland. There's the Episcopalian Church of the US. The Episcopalian Church of Canada. And then in all these African countries, they have their own. There with black bishops. And in each case, each church is autonomous. And some have decided to ordain women and have done so, like the Episcopalian Church in the United States and Canada and in New Zealand. Some have not decided to do so yet, like in England. And so there's a kind of pluralism. Each finds its own way. Now, it's not the thing is, it's quite a flexible model. Anglicanism doesn't have the same problems with the Pope and the strong tradition of authority. It's a much more autonomous church, and in its organisation, each bishop has a high degree of autonomy, and each parish priest does too. So it's in his own parish. So that's one model, and it's not the only one. It's not a perfect one, but it's one.
But he's also said that religion, organized religion, is at its lowest ebb. And I think you told me that the attendance in churches and Anglican churches in England is at its lowest ebb.
It's now running at slightly under 2% of the population. 2%. 2%.
So somehow the flexibility of this system, which does indeed sound ideal for the purpose I'm describing in this fantasy, is actually of no use. That has no attraction to people. And so what would be necessary in order to reverse this trend, to make it really of obvious benefit to go there?
Well, you might first ask, is it worth doing? In America, attendance at church is much higher, and it convulses the body politic because, unable to fulfill its sacral function, the church has become simply a ruthless lobbying force for fundamentalist social policy. So, I think new institutions, in your first statement, you suggested replacement. I think we should level to the ground and start over, at least in America. The Anglican Church, I think its great virtue, as I understand it, is that it's fairly harmless. But in America, religion leads to hangings, in my experience.
Well, the Episcopal Church in America in particular, since Rupert said they're ordaining women, that seems to be a really major change. And maybe if this were the case in England, which I gather is not
yet, but it
might even gradually increasing rather than decreasing attendance in church.
Well, I think the reason why, I think the main reasons for people attending churches, which have to do with an appreciation of collective participation in ritual, appreciation of the benefit of established forms and a continuous tradition, and appreciation of sacred place. Now, I think that these are three strong arguments for going to services. You're taking place in a traditional ritual at a sacred place which has a validity and a tradition behind it. Now, I think any replacement of the Church of England or of churches as institutions, if it were to be effective, and if it were to sacralize political life, would have to be more than just vast numbers of proliferating tiny cults. It would have to be more than that, but more. It wouldn't really work if it were like the religious landscape of Southern California, with its sort of divisive cultism. There would have to be a certain validity to it where it could authenticate the power of the ruler, and the power of the political system, and validate the entire workings of the body politic. For that, you need something like an established church. And one of the problems of the United States, it doesn't have one, and it can't have one for constitutional reasons. So there's very little way in which the political life in America could be sacralized, since by definition it's secular. Now, so there's a different problem here in America, but say in Britain, you consider this possibility. There is in fact already an established church, which fulfills many of the traditional sacralizing roles. It's the custodian of the great sacred places of England, the great cathedrals and many other, Glastonbury Abbey, all these places, under the custody of the established church, which on the whole fulfills this role extremely well, maintains their sacrality and so on. Now, say that this is abolished, or simply allowed to wither and disappear, and say one wants to replace it with another institution which would be able to exert a widespread claim to validity through all classes of society. How would one go about doing it? I mean, the one reason I don't think that's a feasible route to follow is that I think you'd simply have a proliferation of endless small cults or sects, and that you'd be left with a secular authority and a whole secular official life which was thoroughly desacralized.
Well, one answer might be you have to find a religious mission of sufficient consequence to command that kind of loyalty.
Mythology, you need a unifying principle.
This fellow that I mentioned, Dave Brower of the Sierra Club, he actually said, to save the earth, we need an outbreak of religious mania that would dwarf Islam. This is an idea which can send millions on the move. This is the new idea. It counts above everything, and it will sweep across national borders and topple dynasties and melt away.
All right, so that gets a pretty clean aura,
and
and sort of defines his skeleton a little bit better.
He called for a jihad to save the earth.
Now I'm going to mix up a little bit of purple
Kind of thing,
and fix the wall and the space surrounding the television.
I'm a very big fan of the archaic revival, but as we talk about feudalism and look around the earth, we might ask ourselves, where is it that an archaic revival is actually underway and how's it going. And the obvious example is Iran, where, people took archaic revival seriously, took old religious forms seriously, the importance of resuming old rituals, the importance of returning to tried and true ways. And it's, I don't think, the kind of, not what we have in mind.
Well, they returned to a time when the sacred thread was already broken.
You mean the 14th century or
Yes,
something like that?
I mean, the essence here is the actual connection to the sacred. And I think now we can't have an archaic revival by going backwards exactly. We have to do our archaeology of knowledge to the point where we understand what the essence of it was, and to revive that, we need to bring it into modern form. It would have to acknowledge, for example, that the total population of the planet is larger now than then. That means that recycling is mandatory. That means that green consciousness, Gaia, hypothesis consciousness, would have to actually play a leading role in the actual rituals performed on the Ragas days and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So the mandate, I think, to create a new mythology that could organize different styles of churches on a path of convergent evolution would be one that was intrinsically attractive because it actually offered a reversal of the present trend that was somehow obvious to people.
What about resacralization through religion as a slogan? I mean, it appeals to many people as being a new idea.
Well, the churches would have to be taken over. I mean, where you have still a church government, a government that's excommunicating preachers for acknowledging the equality of women or something. This is too far removed from the current state of what the average person in our society knows to be attractive.
I think the thing is that religious reform has to come through the movement actually getting going and being practiced and through example. And, it could spread. Either one could have the growth of a new religion like, say, an ayahuasca church or something like that, spreading spontaneously an entirely new thing. But sooner or later, I think to gain any authority, it would have to undergo a kind of syncretism with the existing structures of religion. And it could be reinvigorated in that way. That's one way it could happen.
So a localization of control of the church would aid this process.
It would aid the process, yes. But I mean, the only other way it could happen, as far as I could see, would be through neo-pagan religious movements starting up in various ways. They'd then have to go back further than the sacred Christian sites. They'd have to connect with Aboriginal.
Well, that would be this jihad to save the earth, an outbreak of paganism.
But the thing is that paganism emerging in a post-Christian context would be so heavily flavored with Christianity that one could say that it was a kind of neo-Christian paganism.
Well, then shamanism, the yet further back.
Well, jihads are not present in shamanism in the same way, I should think. The thing is that jihad is a particular model with Jewish roots, perfected most by Islam, whose colour, incidentally, is green. And if one says that the green movement should have a jihad, one has to remember that all the shrines of the saints and the colour of the prophet is green. But jihads, they come out of the whole sort of Judaic crusade, jihad, and the Jewish holy wars and so on. That's the particular field from which the concept comes.
Mm-hmm.
And a green mass movement, you see, the most natural thing in a place like California would have decentralized movements of small cults, each with their following, a kind of entrepreneurial cult economy, with no dominating giants, and probably some secular antitrust laws to stop any from getting too big. So, but that wouldn't cause a mass movement. A mass movement of crusader or jihad requires a much more unified movement.
I think convergent evolution is a gentler way to go. I think that there's a real gap, a conflict between the two different strategies of starting a new system based on the archaic revival, or pagan revival on the one hand, and revolution of the church's resacralization by religion on the other hand. And that has to do with traditional church practice of denying the validity of previous forms, archaic pagan forms, and particularly carried to the point of revising history, pulverizing goddess figurines and statues and so on. What would be necessary besides partnership of the genders, local control, the green politic, and so on within the ritual of the church would be an acknowledgement of the validity of the essential religiosity of the pagan forms, including the goddess, the worship of idols, and so on. And that means that the Bible might have to be, here it is, abandoned. The Bible might have to be abandoned as sacred document of the church.
Yeah, reinterpreted.
Reinterpreted.
That's a process that goes on continually. The whole development of the Christian religion, like any other, depends on a series of reinterpretations of traditional texts. So the reinterpretation that's going on right now is through the process theologians that attempt to develop the idea of an evolutionary God, an evolutionary universe. That's one major strand of theological reinterpretation. And they have a very strong case because the God of the Old Testament is not a Platonic, transcendent God outside history. He's a thoroughly hands-on, interactive God who's present within history, even those in details, like the passage through the Red Sea. This is an interactive process. It's an ongoing providence that's guiding the historical process. That's the Jewish conception of God, a kind of process God. They would say, and I think they're right, that this is in fact the true Judeo-Christian conception. So a process evolutionary model is one revolution going on in theology. Another is the recovery of the feminine and a recovery of the tradition of the Shekinah, the feminine presence of God. Sophia, the holy wisdom, is the feminine wisdom principle, which is it could fulfill many of the laws of the royal soul, which is feminine. And a revival of that whole tradition, these revolutions are actually occurring in theology right now.
I think convergent evolution is a gentler way to go. I think that there's a real gap, a conflict between the two different strategies of starting a new system based on the archaic revival, or pagan revival on the one hand, and revolution of the church's resacralization by religion on the other hand. And that has to do with traditional church practice of denying the validity of previous forms, archaic pagan forms, and particularly carried to the point of revising history, pulverizing goddess figurines and statues and so on. What would be necessary besides partnership of the genders, local control, the green politic, and so on within the ritual of the church would be an acknowledgement of the validity of the essential religiosity of the pagan forms, including the goddess, the worship of idols, and so on. And that means that the Bible might have to be, here it is, abandoned. The Bible might have to be abandoned as sacred document of the church.
Yeah, reinterpreted.
Reinterpreted.
That's a process that goes on continually. The whole development of the Christian religion, like any other, depends on a series of reinterpretations of traditional texts. So the reinterpretation that's going on right now is through the process theologians that attempt to develop the idea of an evolutionary God, an evolutionary universe. That's one major strand of theological reinterpretation. And they have a very strong case because the God of the Old Testament is not a Platonic, transcendent God outside history. He's a thoroughly hands-on, interactive God who's present within history, even those in details, like the passage through the Red Sea. This is an interactive process. It's an ongoing providence that's guiding the historical process. That's the Jewish conception of God, a kind of process God. they would say, and I think they're right, that this is in fact the true Judeo-Christian conception. So a process evolutionary model is one revolution going on in theology. Another is the recovery of the feminine and a recovery of the tradition of the Shekinah, the feminine presence of God. Sophia, the Holy Wisdom, is the feminine wisdom principle, which is it could fulfill one of the laws of the world soul, which is feminine. And a revival of that whole tradition is revolutionary actually occurring in theology right now.
What is a tradition of Old Testament scholarship that reinterprets stories about David and Melchizedek or Jericho? I mean, all these.
Alright, well that did run out pretty much this memory session as well, so this will be a long video. But that gets the background straightened up, cleaned up a little bit, a nice variety of colors, and gets the T-Rex skeleton prepped for some real detail now. I can start modeling the bones a little more cleanly with some light and some dark. But for the moment, that gets them in there. They're glowing now, along with the rest of the figure, a little more with the red. Okay, thanks for watching. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting digital allegory. Have a nice night, Earth.